Hey, good morning. Well, it's almost lunchtime, but thanks for coming up to see me. How'd you enjoy your room? Look, I know it's a bit cramped, but that's what happens when you dig out a basement underneath an old school. You see, since APOC took over, schools have largely been ignored. They even forgot to turn off the Wi-Fi or clean out the library. It's not much, but it's home, and, well, it turns out it's a great base. We only come up during the day, though. Turning the lights on is just asking for trouble. Honestly, my favorite room is the one upstairs in the corner. Just great views. Anyways, you hungry? I hope you like Bojangles. We have to meet a contact there. One of the cashiers is a person I've been working. Her brother's a deputy in the mayor's office. Lucky for us, he's sloppy. Leaves his computer open, jump drives laying around. Apparently this morning she just grabbed a USB off the kitchen counter that had been sitting there for a day or two. He works in the historic memory department, so this could be pretty big. Let's go, I'll buy you a biscuit.
The people living in the British colonies never saw themselves as anything but British. They were British citizens who just happened to live in the colonies in the Americas. Because of this, they felt that they had the rights of Englishmen, and it is actually written into most of their charters that they had the rights of Englishmen. This means that their beliefs for politics and for their rights were based on basically two major documents. The first was the Magna Carta, and the second was the English Bill of Rights. In the Magna Carta, which goes back a few hundred years at this point, the Magna Carta recognized the right of the people to have representation approve of any taxes that were levied against them, which means if there's going to be a new tax, they had to have their representatives vote on it. The Magna Carta also protected people's rights through a jury of peers, which means the people that were like them and around them could have a say on whether they were guilty or innocent in a trial. The basis of this is a notion of the rule of law. Now, the rule of law simply means that everybody in the society, even the king himself, was subject to the same law. He was subject to the same crimes and punishment expectations as every other citizen. This means that the laws had to be clear, they had to be fairly enforced, and they had to be well understood by everybody in society. So there was a lot of political expectations here. The English Bill of Rights continued and reaffirmed the rights of taxation only with representation and the jury of peers. It also came up with the concept that the king needed to be limited by a parliament, which means a legislative body. And important for our society is that it also affirmed an idea of religious freedom. The important thing to remember is that the colonies all felt that Parliament, the main governing body of the British Empire, because it did not have American representatives in it, it was only the people in the British island, did not truly represent the American colonies. It was the colonial assemblies that had the power to approve their taxes and the power to control the rule of law.
Hi. Oh, hey, Nina. Yeah, look, we're gonna have 2 chicken biscuits and 2 large coffees. And I'm with Steve, and he said you got some of my mail. Hey, thanks. All right, let's go get to work on this. Grab that booth in the back over there.
Because the colonists felt that only their representatives had the power to tax them and really govern their societies, all 13 colonies had some form of a colonial assembly by the time of the American Revolution. The earliest examples are the Mayflower Compact, the New England Town Meetings, and the Virginia House of Burgesses. Now let's start with the Virginia House of Burgesses, which has that very hierarchical society. And in this society, because life was dangerous in the Virginia colonies, about 50% died within a year early on, they wanted to increase the number of plantation owners who would come and actually settle the land and make it productive. So the Virginia Company, and later the Royal Colonies, established that a Virginia House of Burgesses that was run by the planter elites. You had to be a wealthy property owner in order to vote in that society. So it's not really democratic, but it's an early step towards the democratic process. In New England, they signed the Mayflower Compact getting off of the Mayflower ship in Massachusetts because they knew that life was going to be harsh and that the people had to work together in order to form a government. This is a really early example of the idea of consent to the governed, that the power of government comes from the authority of the people, not some random person in Britain. This means that it is an example of an early self-government. New England itself, because the Puritan church was relatively egalitarian, the members of the church actually governed the church. It also acted as a governor of the civil society as well. So all the male members of the church were allowed to participate in what's known as a town meeting. The town meetings essentially is a direct democracy. And in this town meeting system, they also later would vote on a representative that would go serve on the general court in Boston. It's important to note that by the American Revolution, all 13 colonies had some sort of a representative assembly, a colonial assembly, which had the right to levy taxes. So when we get to later on, they're not complaining so much about the amount of the taxes, but rather the fact that it's not their representatives that are coming up with the taxes.
Awesome. This is just the kind of thing we're looking for. That guy's Powley. We found some of his stuff before. He was a teacher from a time before the takeover. He'd recorded all of his lectures as APOC was coming onto the political scene. We found what we think was his last lecture. Maybe it was his first. He left a message that he'd been hiding some of his work around the area. We also know that APOC collects digital records of the old histories, which they then use to go and manipulate. Powley's work is pretty good for a broad content and context understanding. Oh, hey, that's our order. Look, I'll be right back. You work on this.
Being British colonies, the colonies were affected by the events in Britain. And in the mid-1600s in Britain, there was a lot of turmoil throughout, all the way up until about 1688. During the mid-century in England, because of a lot of the conflicts, the colonies were largely left on their own. And because they were left on their own, they largely developed their own political institutions, the New England Town Meetings and the House of Burgesses and so forth. All of these colonial assemblies benefited from what's known as salutary neglect. The British largely left the colonies alone, and as long as they were not causing problems, they could really run their own institutions. After about a century, in 1688, King James was overthrown in what's known as the Glorious Revolution, and he's replaced by William and Mary. And William and Mary were forced to sign the English Bill of Rights in order to take the throne. The document reaffirmed all of the rights of Englishmen we talked about before, the right to only be taxed by your representatives, the trial by jury, religious freedom, and most importantly, in Britain, they were forced to accept the supremacy of the British Parliament, meaning the governing body of England. And it's during this time period, in order to support this system, a guy named John Locke develops. And he's an enlightened philosopher. This Enlightenment period gives rise to a lot of the ideals that our country is founded on, the United States. Locke had two main ideas that we need to be aware of because they find their way into the Declaration of Independence. The first is the concept that we all have natural rights. And these rights, according to John Locke, are life, liberty, and property. Now, this changes a little bit in the Declaration of Independence. But he also has a concept known as the social contract theory. And in the social contract theory, there's two parts to this. The first is that government is instituted among people in order to protect those natural rights. So we give up some of our freedoms in order to have our natural rights protected. Locke then said that the government's purpose is to protect those rights. And if the government stops protecting those rights, then we can overthrow the government and start a new one. In other words, this is the idea of the consent of the governed. The people are the governed, and therefore the government has to protect the rights of the people. If it stops protecting those rights, the people can overthrow the government and create a new one. So the government really rests on the will of the people.
Hey, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting you're new to all this. Here's a quick crash course on APOC. We aren't sure exactly when, but sometime in the early 2000s, this political group known as the Armed Protectors of the Constitution came onto the scene. Their sole message was that we needed to have more, quote-unquote, common sense, and called for, getting things done. It seemed that the U.S. was pretty ripe for this kind of nonsense, since the American education system had slowly whittled away civics and history education in favor of more jobs programs. Lots of patriotic mumbo-jumbo, but very little in the way of critical thinking or evidence analysis. Oh, man. Just a minute. Hey, Nina, I ordered you chicken biscuit, and this is clearly sausage.
During the late 1600s and even up into the early 1700s, Parliament really had no desire to directly control the colonies. They had the Navigation Acts that were in place that largely controlled the trade between the colonies and the mother country. The mercantilist policy was working. They really had no desire. It was a long ways away, so the distance made it cumbersome. And this policy of salutary neglect allowed the colonial assemblies to gain a lot of power. Largely, the colonies were left to govern themselves, and the colonial assemblies used that power. They began to tax the citizens. This was seen as a perfectly acceptable and legitimate right for the colonial assemblies. And it's the French and Indian War that causes all the problems that change this salutary neglect. The French and Indian War was a 7 years war. It's very expensive. The British sent a lot of troops to the Americas, but it's a worldwide war for them, so they go into a lot of debt. And as a result of this, there are two big policies that emerge that change from the period of salutary neglect to the post-French and Indian War. The first is that the British decided that protecting the Americans is expensive and that they should really start to protect themselves. They instituted a policy known as the Proclamation of 1763, which prevented the Americans from crossing the Appalachian Mountains and settling in the territory just gained after the French and Indian War. The reason that they did this was largely financial. There's Native Americans living west of the Appalachian Mountains, and they didn't want to have to send British troops out there to defend settlers from the Native Americans. The second thing that comes as a result of this is an increase in the desire to get Americans to help pay the British debts. Now, the Americans felt that they were paying taxes legitimately to their colonial assemblies, but that because they had no representation in Parliament, that the Parliament couldn't tax them directly. They could mess with the trade relationships through things like the Navigation Acts because that's mercantilism and that's what the colonies are there for. But because they had no representation in Parliament, it was not okay for Parliament to tax them directly. Another thing that they did was start to crack down on smugglers that were trying to get around the Navigation Acts, that were trying to trade with France and Portugal and all the others. And by cracking down on the smugglers, they took those smugglers into admiralty courts, or almost like a court-martial. And that violated the idea of the jury of peers. We're going to see that as a frustration as well.
All right, now that's better. Where was I? Right. APOCs, simple slogans, became gospel to their followers. They started taking that armed part pretty seriously, too. They moved towards their totalitarianism, not in one big event, but kind of slowly over time. They lost most of their elections early on, and then started to ramp up their violent rhetoric. Eventually, they used mob violence to intimidate people away from the polls. And then the attacks began. Some people blamed foreign powers, some people blamed APOC, but in the end, it didn't really matter. In the chaos, APOC offered simple solutions, and people clung to them for security, in spite of the clear threat to the Constitution. Minor infractions built on each other until we're essentially in a police state now. APOC eventually created the Department of Historic Memory to describe the... Well, just a second, that guy's staring a bit too much.
The build-up towards the American Revolution is largely a story of missing perspectives. The British thought that after the French and Indian War, the Americans should start to help pay off some of the war debt. It was British soldiers and British taxes that paid for the French and Indian War. From the American side, they thought that their rights of Englishmen were being violated, that because they had no representation in Parliament, that they couldn't be taxed by Parliament. So we have people talking past each other, and there's a lot of conflict here because of that. The first act after the French and Indian War that really irritated the Americans was the Sugar Act. Now, this isn't because of taxes, but because of the admiralty courts that violated the idea of the jury of peers. The Americans responded by protesting the Sugar Act. They also protested by increasing the smuggling. So they were openly violating the laws now. The first direct tax that really irritated the Americans and got them in the streets shouting "no taxation without representation" was the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act, don't really need to know the details. It was a tax on legal documents, things like wills, newspapers, but they even taxed things like playing cards and dice. And the Americans were upset not because of the high tax, because the tax wasn't really that high. The problem was that they were being taxed without representation. The Americans responded in three ways. The first way was they formed what's called the Stamp Act Congress. And the Stamp Act Congress wrote a letter to the king and Parliament to complain that this was not a not within their right. It was largely ignored. They responded two other ways. The first was through violence. The colonists formed the Sons of Liberty, and the Sons of Liberty violently opposed tax collectors. They would tar and feather them, sometimes even hang them. In both cases, oftentimes the tax collectors died. This is using violence to try to change a political policy. The third way that they responded was through boycott. Also called a non-importation agreement. They agreed to not import British products. Now, by this point, the Americans accounted for anywhere between a fourth and a third of all British sales. So the boycott was incredibly effective. And it's the British corporations and companies that go to the British Parliament and say, this is just not working, and eventually get the tax repealed. The British Parliament responded by increasing the number of troops here in the Americas. The troops are stationed all over. Sometimes they're even quartered in colonists' houses. Because of the increased presence of the British troops, the Americans responded by increasing their drills in the streets of what are going to be known as Minutemen, probably better called militia. So the Americans and the British are now openly conflicting with each other. This all comes to a head with the Boston Massacre, where British soldiers being threatened by Americans in the streets at night defended themselves, at least according to the court case, and killed several Americans. From the American point of view, this is British attacking Americans. From the British point of view, the Americans were becoming rabble-rousers and causing problems. In the end, though, what this is important is that it alienated the Americans and continued the frustration started with the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act.
Sorry about that. I know I get a bit worked up about this. So, this Powley guy, notice a resemblance? Personally, I think he's a distant relative. Anyways, APOC created the Department of Historic Memory because the public's historic memory is important. Our understanding of history can influence how people feel about things. To shape memory is to then control the people. Our mission is to give the population a more accurate view of the past, so they can have more freedom in their choices. If you've only ever been told one perspective, it's hard to make an actual choice. APOC has been lying for decades and then manipulates the historic record to support their lies. If we get a more complete narrative out there, we have a chance to help people start to think for themselves. All right, back to work for a little bit.
A couple of years after the repeal of the Stamp Act and the Boston Massacre, after things had settled down for a little bit, a new prime minister by the name of Townshend tried to re-implement some direct taxes on the colonies, a loose collection of taxes on things like paint, lead, glass, tea, known as the Townshend Acts. This led to that same pattern. The Americans protested and most of the taxes were repealed. They did leave the Tea Act on. The problem with the Tea Act, though, from the American point of view, was that it lowered the tax on tea, which meant that more Americans might actually buy the tea and then accidentally be paying a tax. And if they paid the tax on the tea, then the British could come back and say, well, you paid the tax on the tea because it was cheaper, so you're not really complaining about your rights as Englishmen, you just don't want to pay high taxes. And we have to remember that they're not complaining about paying high taxes, they're complaining about no taxation without representation. So the Sons of Liberty and others actually took it in their own hands to oppose the Tea Act. And they did so by refusing to allow British tea to enter the colonies. They did this all up and down the East Coast. The most famous example, though, is the Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty actually boarded a ship and dumped all the tea into the harbor. Again, this was a protest against the Tea Act and the potential tax that would be paid on that tea. The Boston Tea Party directly led to what the British called the Coercive Acts and what the Americans called the Intolerable Acts. There's a few important parts of this. The first is that they closed the port of Boston. They can't pay off the tax and the penalty without the port being open. The second is that they get rid of the New England town meetings, which took away that colonial assembly that the Americans thought was their right and would control the taxes. They quartered troops within the American homes, and they moved all the trials over to England. Now, the problem with that is it took away the rights to a trial by jury. So the Americans had been protesting about their rights as Englishmen, and the Intolerable Acts essentially eliminated those rights entirely. More drilling by the militia, and the British got word that there was a potential store of weapons in a place called Concord. So a British unit marches to Concord. About halfway there, they meet some resistance in a place called Lexington. After a short standoff, somebody fired a shot, and the first shots of the American Revolution are fired at Lexington. The American militia runs away after one volley. The British proceed on to Concord, find that this weapons store has been moved away. As they march back to Boston, a few miles away, the Americans are hiding in the woods, and their sharpshooters pick off a quarter of the British troops on the way back to Boston. This is known as the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and is called the shots heard around the world. It leads to dominoes that eventually lead to the Declaration of Independence.
Here, have some coffee. I know this is a lot to take in. Here's some more modern politics. I'm sure you know the president. Her name's Emma Gauss, and she's in charge. She's the figurehead. She's also very dangerous. What you probably don't know is that the rest of the government is basically gangsters and enforcers. They refer to the Constitution and the founders, but they like to cherry pick the parts that they like, and they bury those that they don't. I mean, think about it. When's the last time you saw the actual full Constitution? No, not the quotes that they put on the posters or the pieces in their speeches. The full Constitution. APOC also controls the local government. Our own Mayor Cromwell seems nice enough, but I mean, he's a dangerous low-level enforcer. Got to keep an eye out for him.
There are a few things about the American Revolution that I really just want to reiterate, and that is that the Americans were never fighting for the taxes were too high. Taxes were much higher in Britain. The Americans were trying to get back to that time of salutary neglect where the colonial assemblies were the ones that had the authority to tax them, and the British Parliament largely left them alone. They weren't trying to start a new government. They never saw themselves as potential Americans. They were always British people who lived in America. So they weren't trying to seek to form some new government. They didn't really want independence at the time of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. That was mostly an accident. In fact, at the Second Continental Congress, the Americans wrote an apology letter called the Olive Branch Petition and tried to get out of that problem. It takes a year before the Declaration of Independence is signed. And there's several other conflicts that happened in that zone that the Americans kept trying to back away from. What they really wanted was to have their colonial legislatures recognized as being the ones that had the right to impose taxes, and Parliament would largely leave them alone.
All right, one last thing. You know Mayor Cromwell. He's around all over the place. But he plays an important part of the Department of Historic Memory. Myrtle Beach is a prime storage location for APOC documents. Since so many officials come here on vacation, they need the historic data on hand. We know they've hidden archives and data dumps around the area, and we know where a lot of them are. In fact, you've probably been within a few dozen yards of some of the spots, and dang it. Look out there in the parking lot. That looks like a secret police model car. I need you to calmly put your laptop in your bag and go into the restroom. Do some work in there. I'll text you with some more info when it's clear.